My name is Sheik Karim Al-Mansour, and I am about to tell you a story that cost me everything, absolutely everything I once considered precious. My family, my reputation, my career, my place in society. But this same story, this very event that took everything from me, also gave me something infinitely greater than all those things combined. It gave me the truth. It gave me Jesus Christ. I feel an immense urgency to tell you this, because time is running out. I need you to know, with all the certainty a man can have, that what I experienced was real. It was not a dream. It was not a hallucination. It was not the imagination of a dying brain or a lack of oxygen. It was as real as the chair I am sitting in now, as tangible as the air filling my lungs. In fact, it was perhaps more real than anything I had experienced in my entire life before that unique moment. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and for you to understand, I need to start at the beginning. I was born in a small town near Minya, in Upper Egypt. My father was an imam at our local mosque, a man respected by everyone who knew him. My mother had memorized the entire Quran and would recite it beautifully during Ramadan. Since I could walk, I was surrounded by the sounds of prayer, the smell of incense, the rhythm of Islamic life that governed everything we did. It was all I knew. It was all I wanted to know. I was a child who loved to study. While other boys played soccer in the dusty streets, I sat with my father learning Arabic grammar and the Hadith. I memorized the entire Quran. By the time I was 12, my parents were so proud. The entire community celebrated. I can still remember that day, standing before the congregation, reciting the final surahs from memory, seeing the tears in my father's eyes. I felt chosen, special, marked for something important. This foundation was not just education, it was my identity, my air, my absolute and unquestionable truth. By the time I was 20, I was studying Islamic jurisprudence at Al-Azhar University in Cairo. Those were intense years. I devoured books on theology, philosophy, comparative religion. My focus was clear. I learned the arguments that Christians used for their faith specifically so that I could refute them. I studied the Bible not to understand it, but to find its contradictions, its errors, its corruption. I was being trained to be a defender of Islam, a warrior of words and ideas. I returned to my hometown in 2000, at the age of 25, as a qualified Islamic scholar and teacher. The madrasa welcomed me with open arms. Within a few years, I was one of the leading teachers there, instructing boys in Quranic recitation, Islamic law, and theology. I also began giving lectures at the mosque, especially on Fridays. People came to hear me speak. They said I had a gift for making complex ideas simple, for speaking with passion and conviction. I believed it. I felt that fire. In 2005, I married Aisha. She was a good woman from a good family, quiet and devout, everything a Muslim wife should be. We had our first daughter, Fatima, in 2006, and our second, Zara, in 2008. Life seemed complete, perfect. I had a respected position, a loving family, the admiration of my community. I was living exactly the life I had always dreamed of living. My days followed a comfortable and devout pattern. I woke before dawn for the Fajr prayer, then spent an hour reading the Quran and the Hadith. I had breakfast with my family, then went to the madrasa to teach. Afternoons were for study and lecture preparation. Evenings were with my wife and daughters. 5 times a day the call to prayer would sound, and I would stop everything I was doing to pray. It was a life of discipline, structure, devotion. I felt close to Allah. I felt absolutely certain of my path. There was not a single chink in my armor of faith. I was safe. But there was another part of my life that I took very seriously, perhaps even more so than the daily teaching at the madrasa. I saw myself as a defender of the faith, a guardian of the truth. In our town, there was a small Coptic Christian community. Most of the time, we coexisted peacefully. They had their shops, we bought from them. Life went its normal course. However, occasionally, tensions, debates, theological confrontations would arise, and I, with my knowledge from Al-Azhar, made it my personal mission. I felt it was my sacred duty to engage with the Christians whenever the opportunity arose, to show them, with impeccable logic and with the authority of the Quran, the fundamental errors of their beliefs. I sincerely wanted to invite them to the pure truth of Islam. I did not see this as an act of aggression. In my mind, it was an act of mercy. I was offering them the right path, the final and perfected way. I felt energized by this task, like a soldier on the front line of a spiritual battle, fought not with swords, but with theology and rhetoric. I was good at it, and I knew it. I vividly remember the Christian tailor, a man named Basilios, who had a modest shop near the market. He was always friendly, always smiling, even when I stopped by his shop not to buy fabrics, but to initiate a debate. I would openly challenge him about the Trinity, asking with an air of academic superiority how he could worship three gods and still call himself a monotheist. I would ask, how can God have a son? Did he have a wife? I would point out what I had been trained to believe were blatant contradictions in the Bible, quoting verses out of context to prove my point. And Basilios, he would just listen. He would listen with a patience that, at the time, I mistook for weakness or ignorance. He would respond gently, never raising his voice, trying to explain his faith to me simply. But, being completely honest now, I never truly listened to his answers. I wasn't there for a dialogue. I was there to win. I was too busy mentally preparing my next argument, my next logical refutation, to truly absorb anything he said. I would leave his shop feeling sorry for him, convinced of his delusion, and satisfied with my own ability to dismantle his faith. There was also the local Coptic priest, Father Athanasius, with whom I debated several times in organized public forums. These debates were events in our small town. They drew large crowds. Men from both sides came to watch, to cheer for their champion. I would prepare for these debates for weeks. I would arrive with stacks of notes, verses from the Quran, quotes from renowned Islamic scholars, sharp logical arguments against Christian doctrine. I was confident, I admit now, arrogantly so. I saw myself as the champion of truth, the protector of the Muslim community. I genuinely believed I was doing Allah's work, protecting simple Muslims from being led astray by Christian missionaries and the confusing ideas they spread. I spoke loudly, with passion. I gesticulated. I wanted a performance, not just a theological debate. I wanted people to see the unshakable strength and clarity of Islam in contrast to what I considered the illogical and polytheistic confusion of Christianity. I always felt I emerged victorious, and the applause of my Muslim brothers confirmed it. My favorite topics, the ones I felt were the strongest, most indefensible blows, were the divinity of Christ and the crucifixion. I would explain with great academic authority, citing sources, that Jesus, or Isa, was merely a prophet. A great prophet, yes, one of the greatest, but still a man, a servant of Allah, not the Son of God. I ridiculed this idea as pagan blasphemy. And then I would attack the crucifixion. I would confidently quote Surah 4, verse 157, which clearly states that they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but so it was made to appear to them. I argued that the entire foundation of Christianity, the resurrection, the redemption, rested on a lie, on a historical misunderstanding, on scriptures that had been corrupted and altered over the centuries. The people in the mosque nodded in agreement, their eyes filled with admiration for my defense of the faith. And I, in my heart, genuinely believed I was serving God. There was not a single doubt in my mind, no question in my heart. Islam was right, and everything else was wrong. It was that simple. It was this certainty that defined my existence. My Friday lectures at the mosque became highly attended events. I prepared sermons that were not just spiritual, but intellectual. I always found ways to contrast the logical clarity of Islam with the, in my view, corruptions of other religions, especially Christianity. I explained why Islam was the final perfected revelation, the conclusion of everything that Judaism and Christianity had started but failed to preserve in its pure form. The mosque was packed. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, listening intently, absorbing every word. I heard them murmuring Amen to my prayers and Allahu Akbar when I made a particularly strong point against Christian doctrines. I felt invested with a sacred power, an authority that came both from my knowledge and the fervent approval of my community. I was at the peak of my life, my career, and my faith. I was untouchable, unshakable. But looking back now, with the clarity that only time and transformation can bring, I can see that there were signs. Small, strange things, tiny cracks in the foundation of my certainty, which I dismissed at the time with an ease that frightens me today. Started in late 2014, perhaps November or December. I began to have unusual, disturbing dreams. In these dreams, I saw a brilliant light. Sometimes, there was a figure standing in the middle of this light, but I could never see the face clearly. The figure always wore white, a white so bright it seemed to emit its own light. And in these dreams, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace, but also of power. A power so immense it was almost frightening. I would wake up from these dreams drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, feeling profoundly uneasy, disturbed in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just stress, or something heavy I had eaten before sleeping, or simply the mind processing information in strange ways during sleep. I never, ever told anyone about these dreams. They seemed insignificant, even shameful. Besides the dreams, there were also moments, and this was perhaps even more disturbing, moments during my daily prayers or while I was deep in my studies, when I felt a strange disquiet in my spirit. It's difficult to describe. It was as if something was missing, as if I was searching for something I couldn't even name. It was a feeling of emptiness, right in the center of my being, which contrasted terribly with the absolute certainty I projected to the world. I reacted to this with more discipline. I pushed the feeling away and prayed with more fervor, studied for more hours, assuming it was Shaitan, the devil, trying to distract me from my devotions, trying to plant the seed of doubt in a faithful servant of Allah. My response to this internal unease was not to question, but to become even more rigid in my religious practice, more dedicated in my public defense of Islam. And then, in early 2015, the physical symptoms began. I started to feel occasional chest pains. It was nothing severe, nothing that made me stop. It was more a sensation of tightness, a discomfort that came and went, lasting perhaps a few seconds, and then disappearing. My wife, Aisha, noticed me distractedly rubbing my chest a few times and asked if I was okay. I always told her it was nothing, just the stress of teaching and preparing mosque lectures. After all, I was only 39. I was healthy, active, I didn't smoke, I didn't drink, I didn't fit the profile of someone with heart problems. Heart problems, in my head, were things that happened to older men, men who didn't take care of themselves. I ignored these physical warning signs with the same determination that I ignored the spiritual ones. I had too much work to do. I was too certain of everything to let little aches or strange dreams divert me from my path. March 2015 arrived. I remember it was a beautiful spring, the weather warming up after the colder winter months, and I was preparing for a Friday sermon that I considered special, perhaps one of the most important of my career. The irony of it today is so heavy it almost suffocates me, but the topic I had chosen was about the false claims of Jesus' resurrection. I spent weeks researching, gathering arguments, preparing what I thought would be a definitive refutation. I was going to prove, once and for all, that the resurrection was a myth, a story invented by the disciples, that the body had probably been stolen. I was going to demonstrate that Christianity was built on a foundation of lies and legends. I was excited, eager to present this argument that I had polished so carefully. I felt it would be my best sermon, a final, logical blow against the local Christian faith. I was sharpening my intellectual blade for the perfect strike. The morning of Friday, March 13, 2015, began like any other Friday of my adult life, exactly the same. I woke up well before dawn, the sound of the first call to prayer echoing faintly through the town. I rose from bed in the dark, feeling the fresh morning air on my skin. I went to the bathroom and meticulously performed my ablutions, the ritual washing before prayer, the cold water on my arms, my face, my feet. Every movement was automatic, practiced, a choreography of devotion that I had performed for decades. I prayed the Fajr alone in my room, facing Mecca, going through the familiar motions of standing, bowing, prostrating. I felt centered, clean, connected. I felt righteous. There was no premonition, no sense of impending doom. It was just another morning of a faithful servant preparing to meet his God and serve his community. The absolute normalcy of that moment is perhaps the most frightening thing when I look back. After the prayer, the sun began to rise, and the house came to life. I went to the kitchen, where Aisha was already awake, preparing breakfast. Fresh bread, cheese, olives, hot tea. Our daughters, Fatima and Zara, rushed in, still sleepy, but chattering about something that had happened at school the day before. I sat at the table with them, drank my tea, listened to their childish voices. Aisha reminded me, as she always did on Fridays, to buy a few things at the market after the mosque. It was a mundane conversation, the conversation of any family anywhere. I kissed each of my daughters on the forehead before leaving. I loved them. They were the proof of my blessed life. I was doing everything right. I had a good family, a respected job, a solid faith. Everything was normal, common, safe. I felt unshakable, protected by my devotion and my routine. I was a good man, living a good, correct life. I arrived at the mosque earlier than usual. I wanted to go over my notes one last time, to focus before the sermon. The mosque was a modest building with whitewashed walls and a simple carpet, with the mihrab pointing towards Mecca. It was already beginning to fill up with men coming for the Jumu'ah prayer. I greeted those I knew, shaking hands, exchanging the usual greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum assalam. I felt confident, energized. I could feel the expectation in the air. People knew I was the speaker of the day, and I knew I had a powerful sermon to deliver. I had my notes ready. I knew exactly what I wanted to say, exactly how I was going to dismantle the idea of the resurrection. I sat for a moment, reviewing my main points, savoring the anticipation. I was in my element. I was ready to defend the truth of Allah once again, with all the strength of my conviction and all the power of my intellect. Then the call to prayer sounded, filling the space with its familiar and solemn melody. We stood up as one body and performed the noon prayer together, hundreds of men in unison, the congregation moving in perfect synchronicity, a sea of bodies bowing and prostrating. There was an undeniable beauty to it, a sense of power and unity that always moved me. The soft sound of hundreds of men murmuring the prayers, the smell of the carpet mixed with the faint scent of musk that some wore, the feeling of my knee and my forehead touching the floor at exactly the same instant as the man beside me. It was synchronized devotion, the visible and ordered submission to Allah. I felt part of something vast, ancient, and immutable. When the prayer ended, everyone sat down on the floor, their bodies settling, and a silence of expectation took over the place, broken only by occasional coughs. The mosque was completely packed. Men filled every available space, and some were sitting outside the door, listening through the open windows. It was my moment. I stood up and went to the minbar, the small pulpit. I looked out at all those familiar and expectant faces. Men I had known since childhood, fathers of my students, shopkeepers, farmers, all there, waiting to receive the truth. I began to speak. I don't remember my exact opening words now, but I know I started as I always did, praising Allah, blessing the Prophet Muhammad. I spoke about the importance of defending our faith, about the attacks Islam suffered from the West, about the need to stand firm in the truth revealed in the Quran. The congregation was attentive, nodding in agreement, murmuring their approval. I felt that familiar wave of passion and conviction wash over me. It was what I loved to do. It was what I had been trained for. My voice was strong, clear, filling the hall. I was in complete control, feeling the power of my own rhetoric and the absolute certainty of my message. I was building my case, preparing the ground for my main argument. Then, I plunged into the main topic, the resurrection of Jesus. I began to methodically explain how this was a later addition to the original story, how the disciples, in their desperation, had invented it, how it was likely that the Romans had simply stolen the body to prevent the tomb from becoming a shrine. I was quoting the Islamic scholars, building my argument point by point, logically and irrefutably. My voice was getting louder, more emphatic. I was at the peak of my performance, at the point where I could feel the congregation completely with me. This was the final blow I wanted to deliver, the definitive proof. I was about to quote a verse when, suddenly, it happened. A sudden, massive pain in my chest. Not like the small discomforts I had been feeling. This was different, massive, crushing. It was as if someone had placed an enormous weight, a millstone on my ribcage, and was pressing down with all the force in the world. The pain didn't stay there. It radiated, like liquid fire, down my left arm and up into my jaw. I stopped mid-sentence. My mouth remained open, but the words wouldn't come out. I tried to breathe, but it was like trying to suck air through a clogged straw. The pain intensified, becoming white-hot, all-consuming. I started to gasp. I could feel my heart beating irregularly, erratically, as if it was forgetting how to beat, fluttering and failing. The mosque hall began to spin slowly. I saw the faces of the congregation shift from attention to confusion, and then to concern. Someone in the front row stood up. I tried to raise my hand to say I was okay, to tell him to sit down, but I wasn't okay. My knees buckled. I fell to my knees first, my hands trying to brace myself on the floor. The pain was unbearable now. I heard shouts, people running toward me, a tumult of voices. Someone was yelling my name, Sheik Karim, Sheik Karim. The edges of my vision were darkening, like black curtains closing from both sides. The last thing I remember from that moment was my face hitting the floor, the rough feel of the carpet against my cheek, and then the darkness, complete, absolute, and total darkness. Everything went black, everything went silent, and I was gone. I was dead. I didn't know it at that exact instant, but people later told me what happened next in the mosque. They told me how chaos erupted, how someone ran to call an ambulance, how my brother, who was in the congregation, ran to me and tried to perform CPR, even though he didn't really know how. They told me the ambulance took 23 minutes to arrive because of traffic, and because our town was small and the nearest hospital was far away. They told me how they carried my lifeless body to the back of the ambulance and rushed to the emergency room, the siren cutting through the afternoon silence. At the hospital, a team of doctors and nurses worked frantically on me. They used a defibrillator to shock my heart, administered injections, performed chest compressions. Nothing worked. At 2:47 p.m., 7 minutes after my heart stopped beating in the mosque, The senior doctor looked at the clock and prepared to officially pronounce me dead. But I knew nothing of this. I was no longer there. I was somewhere else. And I was about to discover that everything I thought I knew, everything I had built my entire life upon, was wrong. The transition was instantaneous and utterly disorienting. One moment, I was collapsing in agony on the mosque carpet. The next moment, I was floating near the ceiling, looking down. It is almost impossible to describe the feeling. I did not have a physical body. I had no weight. I felt no gravity. Yet, I could see. I saw everything, not just in front of me, but in all directions at once, like a sphere of consciousness. I had no ears, but I could hear the panic, the screams, the frantic prayers below me. I was pure consciousness, pure perception, free from the limitations of flesh and bone. And down there, on the floor, I could see my own body. I saw it clearly. Men were huddled around it, around me. My brother was pressing my chest with desperation. Someone was shouting into a phone. But when I looked at that body, I felt a strange distance, a detachment. It looked like me. It wore my clothes, but it wasn't me. It was just an empty shell, a vehicle that I had been using and that was now broken on the floor. And the strangest thing of all, I felt no pain whatsoever. The crushing agony of the heart attack had completely vanished. I felt no fear. In that moment, all I felt was a deep, overwhelming confusion. What was happening to me? Why was I up here? Then, I felt a sensation. It wasn't a physical pull, like a rope, but it was real. A force was pulling me, drawing me away from that scene in the mosque. I was being pulled upward, away from my body, away from that place of chaos. I tried to resist. I tried to mentally swim back to my body, but I had no control. I was like a leaf on a powerful river. The walls of the mosque, the ceiling, became transparent, like smoky glass, and then simply dissolved. I was moving incredibly fast, or perhaps I was being moved through some kind of space that was not physical space. I could see glimpses of my town below, the streets, the buildings, the minaret of the mosque, but everything was fading, becoming less real, less solid, like a painting dissolving in water. The pull continued, relentless, and then, as suddenly as it all began, I was nowhere. The world disappeared completely. There was no more town, no sky, no light. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Only darkness. But this was not the darkness of a room with the lights out. It was not the darkness of the deepest night without stars. This was a different darkness. It was a darkness that seemed alive, sentient. It was oppressive, heavy, almost like a thick liquid that enveloped me on all sides. It pressed in on me, though I had no form to be pressed. And with this living darkness came the silence. A total, absolute, and complete silence. There was no sound at all. No heartbeat, no breathing, no distant noise. Nothing. Just me, my consciousness, existing in this terrifying vacuum. And it was then that the fear arrived. Not the worry or anxiety of daily life. This was a raw, primal fear, an existential terror unlike anything I had ever experienced. I wanted to scream, but I had no voice, no lungs. I wanted to run, but I had no legs. I was trapped in this void, this nothingness, completely alone, and for the first time in my existence, completely and absolutely terrified. I was a mind floating in eternal nothingness, and the dread of that solitude was a torture in itself. Time, as we know it, ceased to exist. There was no day, no night, no passing minutes. I could have been in that vacuum of darkness and silence for seconds or for centuries. The feeling was one of an eternity. And in that timeless dread, my mind, my consciousness, began to race frantically, trying to understand. Where was I? I was dead. That seemed obvious. But this place, this was not the place I had taught about. According to the Islamic theology I mastered, when a person dies, they enter barzakh, an intermediate state. Two angels, Munkar and Nakir, were supposed to come. They were supposed to question me about my faith, my deeds, my beliefs. I had taught this to my students hundreds of times. I knew the questions. I knew the right answers. Who is your Lord? What is your religion? Who is your prophet? I was prepared for this interrogation, but there were no angels. There were no questions. There was only this oppressive darkness and this crushing loneliness that seemed to be my only company forever. The absence of what was promised to me was, in a way, more terrifying than the darkness itself. My panic turned into a kind of desperate negotiation. I began to list my credentials, like a man presenting his case to an invisible court. I am Sheik Karim Al-Mansour. I am a Muslim, I shouted into the silence, but no sound came out. I prayed 5 times a day. I never missed a prayer. I fasted in Ramadan every year. I gave charity. I made the pilgrimage to Mecca. I memorized the Quran. I defended the faith. I taught. I fought against the unbelievers. I did everything right. I mentally recited my good deeds, my devotion, my life of righteousness. I was trying to prove that I didn't belong in that place. I was a good Muslim, a respected teacher, a man of God. Where was my peaceful rest? Where was the promise of gardens? Why was I here, in this nothingness, as if I were a mistake, a lost file, something thrown away? I had absolute certainty of my salvation, based on my lineage, my knowledge, and my works. But my works seemed worthless here. The darkness did not answer. The silence did not care about my credentials, and the despair began to turn into something new, something much deeper and darker. A doubt so colossal that it made the fear seem small. What if everything I believed was wrong? What if all my certainty, all my knowledge, all my arrogant confidence had been in vain? What if I spent my entire life passionately defending something that wasn't the complete truth? The thought was so terrifying that I tried to repel it, but it returned with more force. If Islam was right, why hadn't the angels come? Why wasn't the barzakh as I was taught? My entire identity was built on being a Muslim scholar. If that foundation was wrong, then who was I? What had been the meaning of my life? Had I wasted everything? Worse, had I led others, my students, my family, down the wrong path with me? The agony of that question was a torture far greater than the darkness. And then, exactly at the moment when this despair reached its deepest point, at the instant when I felt my very consciousness might fragment under the weight of that terrible doubt, I saw something. It was minuscule at first, just a point of light, like a single star at an impossible distance in the vastness of that infinite darkness. But it was there. It was real. It wasn't a memory. It was something new, and it was growing. That small point began to expand, to get brighter. Or perhaps I was moving toward it. I couldn't tell. But the distance between me and that light was rapidly closing. The light was different from any light I had ever seen on earth. It was not the harsh yellow light of the sun or the cold white light of a lamp. It was a pure, clean, bright light. Yet it did not hurt my eyes. It wasn't harsh. It was beautiful. And as it approached, or I approached it, I felt the oppressive darkness begin to retreat, to pull away, as if it were afraid of the light. The crushing weight began to lift. The silence remained, but it seemed different now, less threatening, as if it were being filled by an expectation. I felt drawn to that light with a force I could not resist. It was like a magnet pulling my very essence. My entire being, which moments before was recoiling in terror, now yearned for it. I wanted to be near it, to be in it, to be surrounded by it. It represented everything the darkness was not: hope, peace, life, perhaps even warmth. My entire consciousness stretched toward it. But at the same time, as I got closer, a new kind of fear began to grow, replacing the dread of the darkness. It was a different fear, a fear of exposure, a fear of being seen, because somehow, on a level I couldn't logically explain, even before I could discern anything within the light, my spirit knew. I knew who was there, and that knowledge, that pre-verbal intuition, terrified me more than the absolute nothingness ever could. I was being pulled toward the one thing in the universe that I had spent my entire life denying. I wanted to flee, but the light was all that existed. The light expanded, or I entered it. It grew until it filled my entire vision, my entire being. The darkness did not just retreat. It was annihilated, evaporated, as if it had never existed. I was suspended in this radiant, infinite whiteness. And then, as I watched without eyes, a figure began to emerge from the brightest center of that light. It was a person, a man, walking towards me. He wore simple robes, but of a white so pure that they made the very light around him seem almost opaque. It was the same white from my dreams, but a million times more real, more intense. As he approached, I could begin to distinguish features: a face, a beard, dark hair, but it was his eyes that captured me and paralyzed me. They were eyes that held a paradox my mind could barely bear. They overflowed with a love so deep, so unconditional, that it was almost painful to look at, but at the same time, they contained a penetrating truth. They were eyes that seemed to see everything about me. Not just what I had done, but what I had thought. Every arrogant debate, every scornful word, every moment of pride, every secret sin I never confessed to anyone. Nothing was hidden from those eyes, and I knew who he was. In the same instant, there was no process of deduction. It was an immediate, absolute, and devastating knowledge. Even though I had spent years of my life proving his divinity was a sham, even though I had taught hundreds of students that he was merely a prophet, nothing more, I knew. There was not the slightest shadow of a doubt. This was Jesus, Isa al-Masih, the one I had argued against, the one I had debated about, the one I had diminished in my teachings, reduced to a controllable historical figure. He was there, he was real, and he was not just a prophet. The majesty that emanated from him, the authority, the light, this was not from a man. This was not from a prophet. This was from God. The terror I felt was unlike anything. It was the terror of being completely, absolutely, and catastrophically wrong about the most important thing in the entire universe. I wanted to flee, as I said. I wanted to dissolve, to go back to the darkness, to hide from that gaze that saw my naked soul. But there was nowhere to go. I was trapped in this space, this in-between place, standing before the person I had spent my life teaching people to reject. A wave of shame washed over me, a shame so heavy it seemed to have a physical force. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was a soul-crushing shame. And then, as he drew even closer, I saw his hands, and there were wounds in them, on the wrists, deep, round, unmistakable marks, and on his feet, the same wounds, wounds that looked like they had been made by nails, wounds from a crucifixion. My mind screamed. The Quran said no. The Quran said he hadn't been crucified, that it had only appeared so, that someone else had been put in his place. But these wounds were real. I could see them. They were healed, but the scars were glorious and terrible, eternal proofs of a suffering, a death, a sacrifice. I collapsed. I had no knees, but my consciousness prostrated itself, unable to look at him. I waited for the judgment, for the condemnation, for the punishment that I, more than anyone, knew I deserved. I waited, huddled in my own shame, for the sentence to be pronounced. I waited for the fire, the annihilation, the righteous anger that I deserved. I had fought against him, spoken against him, actively led hundreds of people away from him. I was his enemy. The punishment should be swift and terrible. But instead of fire, what came was his voice. It was not loud, nor thundering. It was gentle. But there was a weight to it, a sorrow that seemed to contain the suffering of the world. He spoke to me in Arabic, my language, and every word resonated inside me with perfect clarity, like a crystal bell. And what he said was not a condemnation. It was a question. And that question broke me into 1,000 pieces. He looked at me with those eyes full of love and pain and asked, "Karim, why? Why did you persecute me? Why did you turn against me and teach others to do the same?" The question was not one of accusation. It was one of mourning. He was mourning for me. I could not answer. I had no defense. I had thought I was serving God, but I realized, in that devastating instant, that I was serving only my own pride, my own certainty, my own need to be right. Tears came, although I had no eyes to cry. It was a weeping of the soul, a mourning, and a regret so profound they felt like they were tearing me apart from the inside. He stood there, waiting, giving me a moment to absorb the crushing reality of who he was and who I was. The love radiating from him was almost painful in its intensity. It was not the cold judgment I expected. It was not Allah, the distant, the severe, the one who punishes harshly. It was someone, personal, present, suffering for my choices, but, somehow incomprehensibly, still offering me mercy. And then, he did something I will never forget. He extended his hand toward me, that wounded hand, the hand that bore the scar of the crucifixion I denied. He did not touch me, but the gesture was an invitation. He said he was going to show me something. He said he was going to show me the truth. The real truth, not the version I had learned, not the version I had taught, but the truth as it really was. I was about to see things that would change me forever, things for which no amount of study or erudition could have prepared me. And when I accepted his invitation, when my soul leaned toward his outstretched hand, the universe around us instantly changed. The bright white light surrounding us seemed to open, like a veil being pulled aside. And suddenly, we were no longer in that space of pure light. We were somewhere else. No, we were not in a place. We were on the edge of it, looking down into something I had only mentioned in abstract theological terms, a place I used in my sermons to frighten people and keep them in line, a place that I, deep down, never believed could be so real, so literal, so terrible. We were on the edge of hell. Human language is inadequate. Words fail miserably to describe what I saw. But I need to try, because this is the central part of what I was sent back to tell. Hell is real. It is not a metaphor. It is not a symbol of separation. It is a physical place, or perhaps spiritual physical, and it is more horrifying than the worst nightmare any human mind has ever conceived. It was a vast, deep, seemingly bottomless abyss, filled with a dark fire. That sounds like a contradiction, I know, but that's how it was. There were flames, flames that seemed to consume everything, but that gave no light, only a sickly reddish glow. And there was a darkness that existed inside the fire, and the heat, even without a physical body, I could feel it. An oppressive, suffocating heat that radiated in waves, a heat that seemed to burn not the skin, but the very soul. But worse than the visual horror, worse than the suffocating heat, were the sounds. The sounds. I never, in my entire existence, could have imagined such sounds. They were screams, screams of millions of voices, all screaming at the same time, yet I could hear each one individually. It was a chorus of pure agony, and it was not just the sound of physical pain, though that was certainly there. It was the sound of souls in absolute torment, the sound of people who had lost all hope. The sound of people who knew, with a terrible certainty, that their suffering would never, ever end. It was the sound of eternal remorse, of regret that comes too late, of never-ending mourning. Along with the screams, there was a smell. Sulfur, yes, as the ancients described, but it was more than that. It was the smell of decay, of spiritual death, of sin in its final rotten form, the smell of everything good and pure having been completely consumed, leaving only corruption. I wanted to turn away. I wanted to close my eyes. I wanted to flee this place with every fiber of my consciousness. But Jesus held me there. He was not punishing me. He was making me witness. He needed me to see. Then I began to see the people, the souls, the consciences that were in that place. They were in an agony that went beyond any physical pain. Their faces, or whatever served as their faces, were contorted in absolute despair. The total realization that this was forever, that there would be no relief, no escape, no second chance. And then the horror became personal. I began to recognize people. I saw men I had respected. I saw Islamic scholars whose books I had studied, whose commentaries on the Quran I had memorized and used in my own sermons. They were there, and they saw me. And when they recognized me, they screamed at me. They stretched out their ethereal hands, pleading, "Sheik Karim, go back and warn them. We were wrong. Everything was wrong. Tell them Jesus is Lord. Tell them He is the only way. Don't let them come here." One man, a theologian I had deeply admired for his logic, looked at me with a torment that tore my soul, his tears evaporating in the heat. "I used my mind to deny the Lord who created me," he shouted, "and I brought thousands with me. Tell them I was wrong. Tell them the truth." I saw people from my own town, devout Muslims whom everyone presumed were in paradise. They were there not because they were bad people, but because they had rejected Christ's sacrifice. Their good deeds, their prayers, their fasts, none of it was enough. I turned to Jesus, my soul screaming in a silent horror and confusion. How could this be? All those good men, all those prophets we revered. And Jesus spoke again, his voice cutting through my anguish. He explained to me that hell was never created for human beings. It was created for Shaitan and his demons. But humans who reject God's provision for their sins, who refuse the gift of salvation offered through Him, they choose to go there of their own free will. God does not send people to hell. People send themselves there by refusing the only rescue that was offered to them. He told me that He died for every one of those souls I was seeing, that His sacrifice was sufficient for every one of them, but they had rejected Him. They had trusted in their own works, in their own religion, in their own goodness, instead of trusting in Him. And now it was eternally too late. I couldn't bear to look any more. The weight of what I was seeing was crushing, an eternity of wrong choices. But Jesus wasn't finished. He told me I needed to see the other reality, the destination for which man was created. And in an instant, without movement, without time, the scene changed. The horror disappeared, the heat was gone, the screams ceased, and we were on the edge of heaven. If hell was beyond words in its horror, heaven was beyond words in its glory. I cannot describe it. I can only say that it was more real, more alive, more solid than anything I have ever experienced. The light was different here. It did not come from a sun. It seemed to emanate from everything, from every leaf, every stone, and the very air. The colors were more vibrant, as if the colors of earth were only pale copies. There were gardens and rivers, but they were perfect, without decay, without death, without even a touch of corruption. And the music, I heard a singing, millions of voices in a harmony so perfect that it was not just sound. It was joy made audible. It was love given voice. And the songs were about Jesus. They praised Him, exalted Him, thanked Him for His sacrifice. And then I saw the people there, and I recognized Basilios, the tailor. He no longer looked old or tired. He was radiant, his face glowing with joy. I saw Father Athanasius, who had been martyred by extremists years before. He was there, more alive than he had ever been on earth. He saw me, and he smiled at me, a smile of pure forgiveness and welcome. Jesus explained to me that these people were not there because they deserved it through their good works. They were there because they had accepted the gift. They had been washed in his blood. They had trusted in his perfect sacrifice and not in themselves. It was all grace. I never wanted to leave, ever. I felt a peace that I didn't even know existed, a feeling of being home on a level I had never known. I wanted to stay there forever. I turned to Jesus and begged him to let me stay. The thought of returning to earth, to that broken world of pain, suffering, and lies, was unbearable. But Jesus shook his head gently. He placed his hand on my shoulder, and I could feel the love and authority flowing from him. "Your time on earth is not yet finished," he said. "You must go back. You must go and tell my people, the Muslims, what you have seen. Tell them that I am real, that I am the Lord, that I died on the cross and rose again. Tell them that I am the only way." He told me that time was short, that his return was near. He warned me that I would face persecution, that I would lose everything. But he promised that he would be with me. And then he looked into my eyes and said the words that sealed my destiny. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And the instant he finished speaking, I felt that pull again. But this time it wasn't gentle. It was violent. An irresistible force tearing me away from heaven, pulling me away from him, away from that light. I was falling back into the darkness, falling toward my body. And with a jolt that felt like a lightning bolt hitting my chest, I slammed back into my flesh. What you have just heard is the testimony of a man who faced eternity and returned transformed. The question that remains is, would you have the courage to sacrifice absolutely everything for the truth? Leave your sincere opinion or your own experience about what you saw here in the comments. We really want to read what you felt. To not miss any more transformative stories like this one, subscribe to the channel now and activate the notification bell. It's the only way to ensure you'll be notified of every new video. Don't leave yet. The recommended video that is now appearing on your screen is the perfect continuation for this reflection. Click on it, and we'll see you there. A big hug, and God bless.